All right, guys. So, how's it going? Pretty good. Excellent. All right. So, next week we're going to dive straight into the problem of free will. But I think that even though that's a metaphysical problem, the work we need to get done today is very, very important for two reasons. One, it's going to set us up to see why the problem of free will and determinism still lingers even today, despite all the science we have. We still haven't figured out whether human beings have free will or are fully determined in their actions, and not just their actions, but even their thoughts, their feelings, everything about them. So what we're going to do today, which is we're going to really focus in on one philosopher called Hume, who's going to isolate a particular problem called the problem of causation. And this problem is going to create such a beautiful summary of two different schools of thought in the history of philosophy that it's going to create a crisis. And that crisis lingers with us today, arguably, but there's one philosopher after Hume called Kant, who at least makes a bold and magnificent attempt to reconcile that crisis. So one of the reasons we're going to get into causation, guys, is because by studying causation, we will be able to figure out whether what we call a human being or a person is the kind of thing that can even be the cause of its own actions. You see that? If you can cause your own actions, then maybe it's possible for there to be something like free will. If that possibility is there, that doesn't guarantee that it actually happens, but at least there'll be a framework for arguing, hey, causes and effects are real things, causation is a real thing, and whatever a person is, he is the kind of thing that can cause his own thoughts, emotions, feelings, actions, things like that. And if he's a candidate for being that, for being an agent, then maybe he can have free will. On the other hand, if it turns out either that he cannot be that kind of thing, or simply that causation doesn't make sense, and causation is like a myth or just a folk idea, which when subjected to philosophical rigorous scrutiny collapses. So if the very idea of causation is not credible, if we discredit the idea of causation, now we're in problems, right? Because if the human person cannot cause its own actions, if the actions of a human being are kind of like effects, and we take the person as a cause, then it's going to turn out that if we discredit the idea of causation, we're not even going to be able to think of the possibility of a person determining his own actions and therefore having free will, okay? But also the other way is going to be true too. If we discredit the idea of causation altogether, it's not going to make sense how nature or other things might cause this person or determine his actions either. So it's going to create a whole new environment of confusion and speculation that mere natural science like physics and chemistry and biology cannot on its own resolve. So what we're doing today is very important for that reason, setting up the free will and determinism problem, but it's also very important from another aspect, which is this problem, as I said before, really brings into focus the tension lingering between two different schools of thought. One is called rationalism, and the other one is called empiricism. And we're going to get into what the essence of those two schools of thought is. They extend all the way back to the roots of Western thought and Western philosophy. But in the early modern period, roughly starting around Descartes, 1600s, all the way to the 1800s, these schools become crystallized in the works of three great philosophers on each side. So the empiricist school gets crystallized in first John Locke, then George Berkeley, and then finally David Hume. And David Hume is who we're going to focus on today after I do a brief summary. Then on the other side, we have Descartes as the father of modern philosophy and the father of rationalism. And after we have the foundation of rationalism, we also have someone coming right on the heels of Descartes and further developing his program. His name was Baruch Spinoza. He was also a very great rationalist. And then finally, guys, we also have something that we might refer to as the culmination of rationalism. Rationalism taken to its extreme by our favorite philosopher, Leibniz. So Leibniz kind of consummates or culminates the rationalist school, and then Hume consummates or culminates the empiricist school. There's a lingering tension that becomes explicit and clear. There's a clash, and it seems irreconcilable the way that Leibniz leaves philosophy and the way Hume leaves philosophy. And we'll talk a little bit about a philosopher called Kant and how he proposed a revolution in how we think about knowledge and the mind and the very notion of activity, the activity of the mind that I was telling you about earlier. Okay? Good. So, the historical story I'm going to tell you is all going to be very, very brief, and hopefully we're going to spend a whole class. I'm going to design a little document, just like we went through logic, and just like we also went through how to write a philosophy paper. I do think that if you have a broad overview of the different trends that have occurred in philosophy, I really think that would be very helpful to you. First of all, just to recognize that, hey, fashion isn't just something, for clothes. Even in philosophy, there's fashions that come and go, trends, And I would like to expose you to that so that you can see that philosophers, no matter how independent they are, if Descartes is doing some meditation and he's withdrawing from society, he's still going to reflect a bit of the fashions of his time. You know what I mean? No person is an island. No person is a complete vacuum. There are trends, and sometimes these trends build momentum and accumulate more and more people and thinkers to it. And sometimes you have an abrupt reaction against the trend, and that creates counterculture, another trend. You see what I mean? So I'm going to figure out a really nice way to compose a very elegant and simple history of Western philosophy, but it's going to be designed not so much to expose you to the details as to expose you to the broader movements and how sometimes these movements recur again and again later in history, and to give you a sense of whether or not we can really talk about progress in philosophy per se. If you begin to question whether or not we really make progress in philosophy, I think that would be a very helpful and healthy exercise for you to engage in, because I certainly question it myself. Hey, Carter. All right, so let's get into it. We have a lot to cover, but this is going to be very fun. It's a good, healthy exercise. So let's start with rationalism. As the name implies, rationalism is the idea that we can figure stuff out. We can figure out significant truths about ourselves and life and the world only using reason alone. We can figure out interesting and important truths about life and the world totally on our own, all right? So, way back in ancient Greece, I told you about Thales, and he was the first person to make a metaphysical proposition that, hey, everything that we see is actually just different forms of one thing. And he proposed that water was that one thing. So as soon as he got that started, that created the seed that generated a whole new type of intellectual activity. There had already been other intellectual activities like mathematics, like art, okay? But this generated a new intellectual activity that we now identify as the beginnings of philosophy. So Thales is known as the first philosopher or the father of philosophy as we know it. But this generated a whole bunch of different reactions to that. We're not going to get into all of it now. There's two figures that come after him that are relevant, though, for our story about rationalism. So the first philosopher is Heraclitus. Heraclitus, coming after Thales, Thales proposed all of this that we see is just an appearance, but the reality is that behind all these different forms and appearances, there's one reality, one thing, and that's water. And this water, just like we see it taking different forms in terms of steam and liquid water and ice, he just extended that and said, well, if it's flexible enough to do all that changing, perhaps under certain conditions, it's flexible enough to encompass all reality. Now, one philosopher who came after Thales was Heraclitus. And Heraclitus basically said, yes, Thales was onto something, but what was really important about what Thales saw wasn't the idea that there's one substance behind all the appearances. And also, it wasn't the idea that that one substance is water. Rather, what's really important from what Thales saw is that our senses deceive us. You see that? When Thales says there's all these different appearances, but there's one reality, now we don't have much of his writing left, but we can speculate that one idea that goes along with that is that, hey, our senses make it seem like there's all this different stuff, right? But in reality, our senses are not telling the real truth. You see that? In reality is very different from the appearance. Now, I'm filling in a lot of gaps. Thales does not talk about appearance or reality or anything. And he doesn't talk about the senses either. But Heraclitus coming after this and building on the momentum of the intellectual activities of people before him, he just point blank says, first, the senses are not reliable in telling us about reality. And second, okay, so why are they not reliable? Because they present to us things as if they are fixed and stable and permanent. So what Heraclitus is saying is that actually what Thales saw in terms of the world as appearance is actually a better representation of reality than that substance called water that he speculated to be real. In other words, yes, the senses are deceiving us, but not totally, partially. When we look at our experience, we can divide it into two broad categories. On the one hand, in our experience, we seem to sense things like change and things like pluralism or variety or diversity or multiplicity. So in our senses, we see appearances, and all these appearances seem to duplicate or replicate the same thing over and over and over again. So it seems like there's multiplicity or diversity. And it also seems that things like motion suggest that an object is changing, as well as things like changes of state or changes of phase, freezing, melting, evaporation, condensation. All these things give a partial view of reality. And then there's another view that our senses give too. The other view is the exact opposite, right? That there are these static things, things that have a permanent location or semi-permanent. But the illusion is that, the appearance is that there are things that are fixed and stable and that have fixed properties that are not changing. So on the one hand, our senses suggest a reality where everything is in flux and there's all this multiplicity and variety. And on the other hand, our senses suggest that there's at least partially some things that are fixed and stable and permanent. So Heraclitus chooses sides. He says our senses do deceive us, but that portion that is deceptive is the permanent, fixed, stable side. For Heraclitus, yes, the senses do deceive us, that there's a kind of permanent reality. So what he suggests is that there are no actual substances or beings in reality. Actual, fixed, stable objects are an illusion. For him, reality is absolute change. So reality is in a constant state of becoming and passing away. There are no beings. You understand? There are no beings. There's just a constant flux, a constant change. Things are constantly changing their state, changing their properties. So there are no stable beings. There is no being, and there is no reality or substance that is a being. Rather, there is a reality, but that reality is totally in flux, constantly multiplying the states that it's in and constantly fluctuating between different states of being. So reality is not being for Heraclitus, it's becoming. And that's a metaphysical assertion. He's saying, not just at the level of appearance do we see change and multiplicity, but this portion of appearance, that part of appearance that suggests flux and change and multiplicity, that's true reality. So our senses deceive us in suggesting permanence and stability, but it does give us a glimpse at true reality when we see all this flux, no stable being. Nothing persists as the way it is. It is always in the process of constantly becoming something else, either in a process of growth and development or in a process of decay and disintegration. But there's no actual stable fixed point at which it just is what it is and is in a state of being. It's constantly in a state of becoming. Okay? So that's Heraclitus, and that's a metaphysical assertion. He's not just saying this is how the world appears. He's saying this is how reality is. Reality is dynamic, fluid, constantly flux. Yep?
I was just wondering if that, like this early point philosophy, you said that there's often an influence of religion, and also kind of like the balance of religion and science and philosophy.
Absolutely.
At this earliest stage, was there a presence of religion?
Absolutely. The Greeks were very religious. You know, now in our modern culture, after a few millennia of Christianity, we tend to think of religion first as monotheism. That's true religion. And second, more specifically, we tend to think of religion as scripture-based. So a true religion will always have some sort of Bible associated with it that literally summarizes everything that God had to reveal, everything. Like anything outside that is supposed to be heresy or something like that. Then we've also been habituated to certain institutions like the church. Then we've also been habituated to thinking of religion historically. In other words, yes, the Greeks were very religious, but they created myths, right? So for the average Greek, in some sense, Homer is telling a mythical story, and in some sense, Homer is telling kind of like pseudo-history maybe, but it's not history the same way Christians treat it. Like, Christians don't say, oh, the Gospels is full of interesting stories and parables, and it's just a really neat story that we tell to console ourselves or to make sense of life. No. For a Christian, Christ actually was born at a certain point in time. He died. He had an actual life. The gospel summarizes that life, and your salvation depends on your belief in the truth of those gospels. Their truth, their historical accuracy. You have to profess that Jesus is Lord and Master, that he's your Savior, and you can't wiggle around that. But yes, the Greeks were very religious, and they had an attitude of wonder and awe at anything that was powerful. And that's the Greek mentality. It's very beautiful because the Greeks are less moralistic than the Abrahamic religions. The Abrahamic religions, like Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, this one God that you believe in tends to be very fixed in his character. And so he also dictates that you have to be fixed in your character. But the Greeks are polytheistic. So one of the consequences of polytheism is that if you have multiplicity, then you must have difference. And that's what you find on Olympus, right? On Olympus, you find Zeus, you find Hera, you have Athena, who has wisdom and cultural adaptability. That's what she gives to Odysseus. You also have Artemis, who blesses people with other powers. You have Ares, who blesses Achilles with that mood for being very warrior-like and very courageous and manly. You have Aphrodite, who blesses Helen, for example, with being divinely beautiful and super erotic. So, two things to notice. One, what's the Greek attitude here? Well, we find power is within us, right? Aggression is a power. But instead of moralizing about it and trying to repress it or prohibit it, they say, hey, this thing inside me is dynamic. Sure, under certain conditions it's destructive, but isn't it rather beautiful? So they have that awe and that sense of beauty for it. And the same with, obviously, Aphrodite and Eros, right? Aphrodite just is a delicate, beautiful being. And so it reflects their sensibilities. You can see it in their sculpture, in the Parthenon, and you can obviously see it in their tragedies, in their dramas. Their expressions of themselves also have this graceful, very charming and delicate aspect to it. So that permeates Greek thought as well. Also, when you transition from Greek religion all the way through Greek art, when you hit Greek philosophy, there is that sense of harmony and that sense of, for example, balance and proportion in everything. So let's take Heraclitus, for example, right? If you want how Heraclitus reflects Greek religious sensibilities, there's an easy example. He says, war is the father of all things. Why would he say that? Well, because he's noticed that it's precisely in opposition and tension between two principles that you create new harmonies, right? If you play a string instrument, you have to tighten the string, right? So there's tension, there's opposition. But by tightening the string, you also create new frequencies and new harmonies, new melodies. So for him, again, when he says war is the father of all things, that's something that a moralistic religion wouldn't appreciate, right? For someone like Jesus, unfortunately, it's supposed to be, his Beatitudes say, blessed are the meek and the mild, right? Blessed are the peacemakers. So Jesus has an aversion to anything violent or destructive, whereas, as I said before, the Greeks are super religious to the point where they allow different gods to reflect the different aspects of human nature, as well as the different aspects of the world, and they worship power wherever they find it. They find power well distributed. So no matter, even if Zeus is the king of the gods, they wouldn't reserve all glory to him. You see what I'm saying? So Heraclitus is reflecting that. Heraclitus is a great example reflecting that. He sees beauty in war. You can see beauty in conflict. You can see beauty in tension. So yes, that religious cultural atmosphere goes straight to the heart of much philosophy. And you see the same thing even with the Enlightenment, right? With the people we're going to talk about today, the rationalists and the empiricists, people like Leibniz, Descartes, Spinoza, they too, in their philosophy, are reflections of their culture, their time, the trends during that time. You are absolutely right that the religion, the broad cultural milieu, and the environment, all of that saturates philosophy. So that's a very good point, Dante, an excellent point. All right, so I was bringing up Heraclitus just so that I could introduce his opponent, his arch nemesis, the guy who says the exact opposite. Parmenides comes right after Heraclitus and says, okay, you got one thing right. The senses do deceive. But now he inverts it. He says, the senses deceive, but what they deceive about, again, is partial. The part where they represent reality as unstable and in flux, that's what it deceives about. But the part that suggests permanence and stability and unity in place of multiplicity, that is what he thinks is reliable. But here's the important part about Parmenides, and here's where he ties into rationalism. Even though Heraclitus said the senses deceive, he did not suggest an alternate route to truth or reality. But Parmenides does. And that's why Parmenides gets many titles. First, he's known as the father of rationalism because he says, yes, Heraclitus, you're right, the senses deceive, and therefore they are unreliable, and therefore we cannot use them. But Heraclitus stops there and just begins to dogmatize about what reality is, right? He picks sides, and the partial understanding of appearances, he just picks that part that's unstable and in flux, and he says that's what reality is. But he doesn't give an alternative basis to the senses. Parmenides says, look, the senses are unstable and unreliable, therefore we cannot use them to find out reality and truth. The only way we can find out reality and truth is by reason. We have to figure out what reality is. We have to reason about what reality is. That's the only reliable way to figure out truth. And that, guys, is the birth of rationalism. So that's why he's called the father of rationalism. Now, does that mean he figured everything out? Does that mean that he figured out what reality is? Does that mean that his conclusions are the ones that are most true and therefore everyone followed him? Of course not. But he started a trend. You see, that's a trend, right? So the trend is, hey, let's start doubting our senses and replacing that with reliance on pure reason alone. And let me give you a classic example of why he's called the father of rationalism. He's called the father of rationalism because what he does is he gives an argument why what our senses presents us with as reality cannot be reality and must be mere appearance. He gives us an argument. He wrote a poem in which he presented his argument. Remember I told you that poetry and art back then, poetry and philosophy rather, were very integrated. When a great philosopher wanted to express himself, like you said, Dante, they would invoke gods, like Parmenides talks about being visited by a god in a vision. So the philosopher, this is a great point. Nietzsche was an interesting philosopher. He said, the philosopher is just a further development of the priest. Very interesting insight. Why would he say that? We'll get to it in a second. But Even Parmenides is writing poems in which he talks about God's visiting him. So you've got an element of revelation, some kind of vision, and then you've got creativity, you've got art, and then within that, he's going to deposit an argument. Very rich. This is very, very rich. And that's why, guys, it's hard to set clear boundaries sometimes between philosophy and art, philosophy and science, philosophy and religion, and then even to try and make philosophy independent of history. All of these things are well integrated. You see what I'm saying? So, Parmenides makes an argument. He says, look, whatever exists must exist necessarily. And whatever does not exist cannot exist. So what he's saying is, and this is like why he's also called the father of metaphysics, in particular the branch of metaphysics called ontology. Because what he's doing is he's saying to exist is the same as to have being. That's what ontology is. For the Greeks, onto means being, and ology means study. So it's a study of being. He's making a remarkable move here. What he's saying is, whatever exists, whatever has the quality of being, necessarily has being. In other words, it can't change. There's necessity there. If you have being, you cannot go from nothing to having being, and you cannot go from having being to being nothing. So once you have this quality of being, it's like you're locked in. You will be forever in the future, and we can also predict that you were always in the past. So anything that has the real status of being for Parmenides is an eternal being, an eternal, unchanging being. Once again, this might be a reflection of his religious sensibilities, right? Maybe he's understood that gods are powerful and great, and at some point he said, wait a minute, but also, in addition to all of that, the gods must have the quality of being. So maybe he speculated and meditated and just came to the conclusion that whatever has this general quality of being must be so adamant, it must be so indestructible that it just doesn't fluctuate. None of its properties fluctuate. No aspect of this thing changes in any respect. It's an eternal, perfect being. All right. So he says, whatever exists, whatever is, necessarily is, and whatever is not, necessarily is not. Now, let's think a little bit about that. What are you saying? You're saying whatever does not have the status of being cannot exist. Now, he's saying that nothing cannot exist. Right? Whatever does not have the status of being cannot exist. So that means nothing cannot exist. So, here we have our senses presenting us with objects in space at distances from each other, right? So you've got a couple of things going on. You've got multiplicity, and you've got in between the objects gaps that people assume might be vacuums or voids. And you've also got the possibility for these things to change their location and change other properties that they have. Parmenides is saying, yes, Heraclitus, you're right. The senses do deceive us. But if we reason and we think about things, we will understand that not only do our senses deceive us, but the part of the appearance and the part of the senses that is rather truthful is the part that suggests permanence, stability, and unchangeability. And that portion can be further ratified and solidified through pure reasoning. And what's the reasoning? Well, The reasoning is ontological reasoning. The argument is whatever has the status of being has the status of being. So how could it change? In other words, to be is to have the kind of status that cannot be anything other than the thing that it is. But it's at a very abstract level, because he's not even talking about any particular being, he's talking about the category of being. Anything that falls into the category of being must be the kind of thing that does not change in any respect. To truly be, to truly be, is to be necessarily, that means you can't help but being, and it also means to not change your properties in any way. So anything that falls short of that and does change, no matter, it might take a long time, but if eventually something changes in some respect, some of its properties change, its location, shape, size, color, whatever, then it never was truly a being to begin with. That's what he's going to say. So what's his logic? Well, once you have the property of being, then any change would suggest that you are either decreasing or increasing that being. You see that? But no, for him, as a matter of pure logic, once you have a property and you truly have it, like it's yours, then it cannot be varied. Therefore, if you have the property of being, you are insulated and immune from all possible change. It is no longer possible. It's not even possible for you to change. If you were to change while still being a being, then you would be involved in a contradiction. You would be contradicting yourself. That would be a logical contradiction. Why? Because if you have the status of being, right? If that's what we know about you, then any change must be a change in that very property. And once that property changes, then you no longer have being. You see, he's making a very abstract statement, but I think he's processing something that we see all around us in appearances. Yes, this object looks relatively permanent and stable. And yes, we can probably speculate there are all sorts of changes that it's gone through in the past and in the future. And even now, there's probably little microscopic changes that we can't see that are happening. But what he's saying is, to the extent that this whole thing as an object has the property of being, that property of being is a categorical ontological property. And if this object as one whole thing has that property, then that locks that being in as it is, and therefore is not subject to any changes. Because any changes would mean it loses the status of being. Okay? And that's how he defends the idea that reality is eternal and unchanging and necessary. Right? Whatever reality is going to turn out to be, it's not going to be the way our senses show it, with all this multiplicity and variety and flux and change. Now, let's look at the other side. Nothingness, right? Nothingness. So he says, what is not cannot be. That is, nothing cannot have the property of being. Now, this is a bit easier, right? That's an open contradiction, right? Nothing, the very definition of nothing is something that does not have being. So if you say nothing exists, you just contradicted yourself. So once again, that leads us back to the first conclusion, right? Because if nothing cannot exist, then the only things that exist are what? Being. The only thing that can exist is being. Now, he takes care of the issue of multiplicity by saying, look, there can't be multiple things, because if there were multiple things, then just like with change, there would be the possibility of transitions between these different things. So the very idea of multiplicity implies a kind of change for him, and therefore he also disqualifies that. So what's the final picture for this Parmenides, who's both a rationalist, father of rationalism, and father of metaphysics, and father ultimately of the distinction between appearance and reality as an abstraction? Like, I think Thales saw appearance and reality, but he didn't make it explicit. But Parmenides is the first philosopher to make it explicit that there's appearance and then there's reality. And reality for him, the only thing that can have that status is being. Anything that's in a state of becoming or flux is imperfect, substandard. It doesn't reach the status of a quality of being. And so his unified vision, basically, of what exists, all that exists is just one thing. One thing is truly real. One thing truly has the quality of being. And he, in his poem, he suggests that the symbol for this thing, the actual shape it has, is a sphere, a completely perfect sphere with a fixed diameter. And it's a perfect sphere, like there's no, you know what I mean? Like the spheres we create in real life or on paper even, they have imperfections. But a perfect sphere, the radius would be the same no matter what, you know what I mean? Now, why would he choose an object like this? Well, I guess one, it reflects the mathematical sensibilities of the ancient Greeks, their love of geometry. I mean, it's from the Greeks that we get Euclid and advanced geometry. It also reflects the idea of unity. There's just one thing. But once he commits himself to the idea that there's only one thing, then now his aesthetic sensibilities might come in, and he might say, well, what's the perfect shape of the one thing that exists? Well, the Greeks loved symmetry, and I think that probably the most symmetrical thing you can think of is probably a sphere, or at least one of the best candidates. So it's a sphere, it has a uniform density, every part of it is just as dense as any other, it's completely homogeneous, it's a perfect sphere, and that's the symbol of what reality is. All this other stuff we see, it's just an illusion. But we can arrive at his ontological conclusion using pure reason. Any questions? Because we're about to accelerate now, so we can head to Hume. So now, fast forward to where we left off last time, Descartes. Descartes inherits the tradition of scholasticism. So basically, in the period before Descartes, in the Middle Ages, you had great philosophers like Thomas Aquinas trying to reconcile Christianity with Aristotle's philosophy. And the church took on Aristotle as a kind of authority. They wanted to make sense conceptually of all that religion. So they had a philosopher like Aquinas try to reconcile the two. And it's in that environment that Descartes was trained by the Jesuits, but he was also trained in mathematics. And also Descartes is beginning to philosophize at a time when Galileo and Copernicus are revolutionizing knowledge as well, because they're inventing natural philosophy, which would also be known as science, right? So Descartes is being influenced in a number of ways. There's a couple of trends. One trend is the religious background, and the authority of Aristotle is suffocating on him, right? It's like we're accepting a whole lot from this guy uncritically. So there's pressure on him to react through critical thinking. Then on top of that, there's the new science. Wow. Science combined with technology like telescopes and microscopes can help us see things we've never seen, get data we've never had, and then make sense of the data and interpret it in new and powerful ways. We can figure out the actual motions of the solar system and its actual layout. We can do powerful things with mathematics, for example, right? So Descartes is an expert mathematician. He's the one who we get our Cartesian coordinates from. Descartes is an expert scientist. He is studying physics and making contributions to both mathematics and physics. And he's even studied the human body a lot. And he's also a religious man. So when we talked about the meditations, it's coming from that kind of environment. And I said there were two big qualities that I wanted to emphasize about his first two meditations. It's the fact that you see, one, a kind of self-reliance, right? He's relying only on himself to figure out the truth. And the church didn't like that. And two, you see subjectivity. Meaning, after you go through this process, what you discover is your own thinking self. But whether or not the external world still exists becomes a really interesting epistemological question. How would you know that what you see aren't just ideas in your own mind? How can you find out the reality behind that? But let's go back to the first one. I said he relies only on himself. Now let's refine that a little, because this has directly to do with Parmenides. Parmenides, all the way through Plato and Aristotle, and then let's just accelerate through the Middle Ages. When we hit Descartes, yes, he is relying on himself, but he's relying on a particular aspect of himself. Just like Parmenides is distrusting the senses and relying on reason. Remember that? Well, what does Descartes do? Remember the first thing he says? I have to get rid of my old foundation for my old beliefs, right? What was that old foundation? Where did he say he got all his beliefs from before? It's the same as Parmenides. What is he skeptical about? What is he doubting? What's the foundation of all his previous beliefs? Any idea? Well, okay, so that's going to be his new foundation, right? He's going to create a new foundation where he says, the first thing that I'm completely certain about, without any doubt, is that I exist. And that's a new foundation. But what was the old foundation? He's meditating and he's finding, man, I've been deluded my whole life. And whatever foundation I have for all of my old beliefs, old and current beliefs, it's really unreliable and shaky. What is he referring to? It's the same as Parmenides. What does Parmenides find unreliable? The senses, that's it, exactly. So, remember, Descartes doesn't go belief by belief. He says, I'm going to be very efficient and effective. Instead of doubting each belief, I'm going to doubt all beliefs that come from an unreliable source. You see that? And that was the senses. That move is analogous to what Parmenides did. And his new move is also analogous to Parmenides. He's a rationalist. Descartes is a rationalist. Why? Because once he doubts the senses, how is he going to figure stuff out now? He's using reason, right? So yes, he relies on himself, but he relies on a particular aspect of himself, his reason. He's going to figure things out by reasoning about it, all right? And that's what Descartes does. He uses skepticism as a method, but that skepticism is self-defeating because you can't doubt because the very act of doubting is evidence of something. You see that? And that's evidence of this new you and the new certainty you have, the new foundation. All right? It's a subjective foundation, but it's a foundation. So what is Descartes doing in the meditations? Well, he's got this world before he starts meditating. It's got God, it's got minds, it's got souls, it's got matter and all sorts of objects. He's going to meditate, he's going to withdraw from all of that, and then he's going to reconstruct it completely conceptually using reason alone. So he is a new type of rationalist, right? And then in his footsteps, we have people like Spinoza, who are going to follow in his footsteps. Spinoza is an amazing philosopher. Bertrand Russell, who won the Nobel Prize along with Einstein. Bertrand Russell said that Spinoza is the noblest and most lovable of all the philosophers. what he's commenting on is not his intellect so much as his character. Now, in this class, we've been taking a very intellectual approach to philosophy, and that's fully in order, that's justified. But I do want to let you know that just like the history of philosophy has some great intellects and some great minds, it also has some amazing, amazing characters and some really, really genuinely good people. But that's beyond the scope of this class. Spinoza is one of those like saints of philosophy, like a prince of philosophy or something. Some people might say Plato and Spinoza are the two princes of philosophy when it comes to like that great intellect plus a great character. So Spinoza modifies basically the conclusions that Descartes reaches, but he uses the same approach. He figures things out using reason, okay? So he constructs a whole metaphysical system called the ethics, in which he starts off by talking about metaphysics, and he argues that there's this one substance that has an infinity of attributes, an infinity of modes, and we are one of those modes. So this position technically is what's known as pantheism. This substance is a God, or is God. And I guess he calls it God simply because it's so awesome and amazing and perfect. It's not God in the sense of like Yahweh speaking and giving laws and acting like a person. It's not a God in that sense. It's an impersonal God, and it's pantheism because God in everything and everything in God, meaning we are just we are modes or ways of being of God. So we are fully integrated in whatever God is, and God is fully integrated in us. Spinoza is a determinist. We're about to study free will and determinism. Spinoza thinks that we are fully determined in everything we do. And that's a consequence of the fact that God is fully determined in everything he does. So that extends to all of his modes. And then Spinoza moves on to psychology and talks about all of our passions and affections and emotions, and how ultimately, because we're unconscious of many of our passions and emotions, that leaves us subject to them, and we live turbulent and violent lives in a state of unconsciousness that is very pathetic, and he sees it as a kind of slavery and living in bondage. So, in the final part of the book, the reason he calls all of this ethics is because the metaphysics is just to help us understand the pathway to living a more ethical life. So how should we live our lives? What is a good life as opposed to a bad life? Roughly speaking, a good life is a conscious life. Again, things are fully determined. You're not going to change how things are in any deep sense. But what your consciousness does, when you raise your consciousness of your hatred and your envy and your greed and your ambition, when you become conscious of them, you go from fluctuating like this because all of them are acting on you to a much more smooth course. You know what I mean? By being conscious of them, you become less responsive to them. They're still going to act on you, and you're never going to be self-determining because, again, he's a determinist. So you're never going to take full control of all of your circumstances or something like that. You are still subject to fate fully, just like the Stoics do. But by raising your consciousness, these blind forces become more gentle. You know what I mean? They become more mellow, if you can put it that way. And that's what the ultimate ethical life is for him. To be real chill, cool, to accept ahead of time that you can't control things, but you can control how savage your passions are. The more intellect and the more conscious attention you give them, it's very interesting. It's something similar is in Buddhism. Because in Buddhism, you have the idea of caring for your anger, caring for your pain, caring for your rage. So you have one energy that's blind and furious, straight out of hell, and then you have another energy that's angelic and nurturing, and they interact. And over time, you can really achieve a kind of peace and tranquility. That's his idea of what a truly benevolent and blessed life is. Again, you're not in control, but you can live with dignity and gentleness. That's it. Okay, how does he justify all this? He's constructing concepts, he's defining, right, what God is, he's defining what a substance is, he's defining what a mode is, he's defining what an attribute is, and then it's almost like dominoes. If you set things up just the right way, it follows a logical consequence, everything throughout his whole system. And so he's deriving implications that are interesting and important and non-trivial just from definitions and axioms. You see that? Kind of like geometry, right? That's what we do in geometry. That's what Euclid does in geometry. Guys, what I'm telling you is absolutely essential. You know why? Because the history of philosophy and how philosophy fell into disfavor, how it became discredited, is built directly into what I'm telling you right now. Think about what we're talking about. Some dude makes a bunch of definitions and axioms on a piece of paper and derives the consequence that God exists, that you are a part of God, that there's only one God, that everything is fully determined. I mean, from a scientific point of view, how is this justifiable? You see that? You can see how a scientist might say, from an aesthetic point of view, Spinoza, your system is magnificent. Aesthetically, it's like a huge Gothic cathedral or something. But logically and empirically, as a matter of things that we experiment with, as a matter of how we test hypotheses, we can't do much of this. And remember, I already told you a little bit of the story where a bunch of people get tired of these vague metaphysical statements, things like all is one, or, you know, God in all and all in God. You know, people get tired of things that you can't test, that you can't verify. And that's going to create its own problems too. I'm not saying that these logical positivists want to verify anything. In the end, there's self-contradiction there too. There are problems with that too. But if you want to understand the trend of anti-metaphysical science, this is kind of where it comes from. A bunch of people defining stuff, and then it follows as a logical consequence all these big assertions, bold assertions about our freedom, about what we truly are, about the relationship between our minds and bodies. Spinoza makes this huge metaphysical superstructure. And he derives all sorts of consequences purely from definitions and logic. And people are like, it's beautiful, it's magnificent, the effort is great, but we can't do anything with that, you know? And then we find Leibniz. After Spinoza comes Leibniz. Guys, there aren't too many records of great philosophers meeting in history, but Leibniz and Spinoza actually did meet. They exchanged notes about their projects and everything. And Leibniz was a genius, there's no doubt about that. That guy, he invented calculus. He was just prolific beyond belief, a polymath. A polymath is kind of like a Renaissance man, but a Renaissance man is more, you know, art and science, whereas a polymath is more like very learned, you know, encyclopedic and just productive in many different areas of knowledge. So Leibniz was a polymath. He contributed to mathematics, physics. No. He gave us our concept of kinetic energy, for example. We come from Leibniz. So the guy is just amazing. However, he is a hyper-rationalist. He takes it to a new level. Leibniz has a principle that he says is the principle of sufficient reason. This principle of sufficient reason basically takes rationalism to its highest extreme. It says, for anything that exists and for anything that is true, there is a sufficient reason for why it is the way it is. So for any truth that exists, for any reality, it can be figured out through reason. Now, he's not saying that we, human beings, can. He thinks we're limited. But if we had enough information and we had a great enough intellect, he thinks that when we look at the world and ourselves and everything in it, we would make perfect sense of it purely rationally, purely for a reason. Now, guys, I can't say he has a lot to support this. This is kind of like almost like a dogmatic faith, right? How do you know that there aren't aspects of the world that don't make sense, that don't add up, that aren't rational? He's literally committed to the idea that everything, literally, the reason why this chair is here and not 1 centimeter to the left or right, there's a deep reason for that. And I think it comes partially because of his monotheism and his Christianity. Remember, Leibniz is the one who corrected Anselm and said, the greatest conceivable being, what you were really saying is absolutely perfect in all possible respects. So maybe what's happening here is that a truly perfect being would be completely omniscient and would have everything in his creation figured out. So what does that imply? Every aspect of the world has a sufficient reason for why it is the way it is and not some other way. Do you see that? Because if you have a great genius God creating everything, there are no accidents, there's nothing sloppy. And when it comes to existentialism, our lives are full of meaning. They have as much meaning as possible because, again, nothing is an accident, right? So we are exactly where we're supposed to be. We're going through exactly what we're supposed to be going through. No matter how much evil or pain, he thinks this is the best of all possible worlds. Guys, this is what we call hyper-rationalism. And you can see why this is going to create a whole bunch of problems when we now compare it to the other school we're going to talk about. With Leibniz, you have hyper-rationalism and hyper-metaphysics. Leibniz thinks this world that we see is saturated with metaphysics. Not just metaphysical significance, but metaphysical beings. He believes in monads. What monads are is basically this, guys. He believes that every physical object is made up of simple substances, simple beings. But that word simple is technical. What simple means is that it has no parts. Because anything that we call a part must be complex. It must have length, breadth, and depth, which means it must have parts. So any part must have smaller parts, and so on and so on. So he believes that anything complex automatically implies it must be made of smaller and smaller parts. So he reasons, his logic takes him to the logical conclusion that every single body in the universe must be made of ultimately bodiless beings. Because anytime you have any part or any body, you have complexity. So wherever you have complexity, it implies an ultimate absolute simplicity. And so the world is full of these atoms. But they're not atoms. They're not the atoms of physics or chemistry. These are now atoms. How can we put this? They are atoms in the sense that they are indivisible, but they're indivisible simply because they are small souls or minds. That's what he thinks the world is made out of. So when I say the world is saturated with metaphysics, he has inverted physics, right? Physics thinks the world is made up of physical atoms, material atoms, and what we call consciousness is just a derivative of that. Complex electrochemical behavior in neural networks gives us mind. But he's inverted that. He's saying, no. Wherever we have matter, that complexity implies an ultimate simplicity that composes it. So whatever is complex must be made of things that are simple, right? And those simple things must be absolutely, utterly simple. So simple that they don't even have length or breadth or depth. And that's his vision of reality. And that competes with Spinoza's, because Spinoza said there's only one substance with an infinity of attributes and modes. Leibniz competes and says, I'm going to reconfigure all of that. Yes, there's a God, but he's just one substance among infinite. He created an infinity of substances, All those substances are independent from one another. Remember the parallelism and the pre-established harmony? God created all these infinite substances, and they all self-regulate. They're all in a pre-established harmony with one another, so that it just appears like they causally interact, but really they don't influence each other at all. God has created them so perfectly, designed them so perfectly that they don't interact at all, but yet they self-regulate autonomously and perfectly. Okay, guys. Now, the other side, empiricism. So way back in the day in the Greeks, you had a group of physicians who rejected established ways of diagnosing diseases and said, no, the way you find out about diseases is by looking at the phenomena, looking at the symptoms, and you do it on a case-by-case basis. So they were known as empirics, and that's where we get our word empiricism from. All right? Now, shooting ahead to John Locke within the Enlightenment. John Locke basically took up the project of saying, look, we need to clean house here. Instead of talking about what really exists and using reason to figure it out, we need to start talking about what are the scope and limits of knowledge, right? So this is now pure epistemology. What he's saying is, before we can talk about, I'm a thinking thing like Descartes or anything like that, we need to figure out what are the faculties or the intellectual resources we're actually working with, and how does that predetermine the very types of things that we even can know, right? So Locke is called the father of empiricism in the modern sense, because he says very clearly, the only source of knowledge is experience. You only get knowledge from the senses. So he is kind of reversing Descartes. He's saying, look, the only place we get knowledge is experience. That's where we get knowledge from. And the form in which we get it is ideas. Now remember, we spent time last class talking about three different things: concepts, facts, and ideas. Look at the difference that's happening now, right? With Descartes, along with Spinoza and Leibniz, what do you have? Concepts, right? What are concepts? Definitional abstractions. So in the rationalist school, what you do is you define things so well and so clearly that once you define them and you assemble them a certain way, you arrive at certain conclusions as a matter of a logical consequence, a necessary logical consequence. It builds its own momentum logically. You don't have to do too much thinking. You just set things up properly, and it's almost like technology. It does the work for you. And that's what a concept is, guys. Think of it technologically. What Socrates invented when he invented the definition, he gave us a new kind of technology. Now, Locke here is saying, look, you cannot abuse technology like that. Yes, concepts are helpful, definitions are helpful, but you can't define things into existence. You can't discover things using definitions. Where do we really make discoveries? Well, in experience. And for that, you have to pay attention psychologically to what your mind is actually made of and what it perceives. You never perceive a bachelor. You perceive a man or a group of men or something like that. You might find out their marital status, and then you can arrive later at this concept of a bachelor, but you never perceive a bachelor. Do you see that? So concepts are secondary and derivative. That's not what the mind operates on. That's not its MO. It's not its modus operandi. So he's correcting what he sees as an over-reliance on conceptual technology, which the rationalists are doing. The person who follows him is Berkeley. He goes even further. And he says, look, Locke was on the right track. We're over-relying on reason and implication and thinking. What we need to emphasize more is perception and intuition, all right? Experiences. That's where we get real knowledge. But he corrects Locke in one important way. Locke had this distinction between primary and secondary qualities. Locke would say the color and the shape and the texture of this object, those are things that are really just in my mind. Those are ideas in my mind. But there's something residual. There's something beyond those that does stick into the chair itself, and he called those primary qualities. And those would be things like substance, extension, number, atoms, things like that. So here we have an empiricist, right, who's looking at the scope and limits of knowledge and is saying what? It's saying, look, our knowledge is limited. We don't know that much because what we're working with doesn't give us access to that much. So he's correcting the rationalists. But even he still reserves some way of knowing something that can't be perceived. You see that? He still says this object in front of me, this material object, there's secondary qualities which are in my mind. Those are the ones that I perceive. But then he just dogmatically says there must be some underlying non-perceived substance or matter. So Berkeley says, no, you're in the right direction, but I'm going to make you consistent with yourself. Let's go all the way to the logical consequence. And there you have the birth of idealism and immaterialism, right? Because if you take that momentum started by Locke, that the only things exist are the things that you experience, well, what follows is that if the only things that exist are the things that you experience, and the only modus operandi, the only MO of the mind is to work with ideas, then it logically follows that everything you experience is nothing but an idea in your mind, and you have no access to things as they are in themselves. So he gets rid of primary qualities, and he says all qualities are nothing but ideas in the mind. Does it make sense, guys? So, we've set things up nicely. It's 7:47. No worries. We'll fit everything in together next time. Now you'll have a much better understanding of where Hume is coming from when he builds off of Locke and Berkeley and criticizes the rationalists. And you'll also have an excellent background for understanding and digesting this free will and determinism that's coming. So don't worry. What I have, this document I have here for you, it's very dense, but it is going to get so clearly to the point, so efficiently and so effectively that within an hour and a half, we will really go deep and we'll go thorough, all right? So don't worry, we didn't get into Hume today, but boy, you have quite a momentum building up to him, and it'll be very easy to understand where he's coming from, why he's so critical in the history, and why he's a turning point, and why he's relevant for free will and determinism. All right, guys, so I'm going to end it there. Any questions?